So welcome. I'd like to welcome all of our students, our staff, our alumni, and our guests, and also representatives from our sponsoring agencies to the 14th Bentley Lecture in Sustainable Agriculture. My name is William Shoddick. I'm the Bocock Chair for Agriculture and the Environment. And it's really a great pleasure for me to welcome Dr. David Sauchyn from University of Regina, and to have him speaking to us today about climate change. So this is a hugely important topic, and it's probably on everybody's mind a lot of the time, and it's wonderful to have an expert here to speak to us about this, and specifically how agriculture can be part of a plan for stabilizing the global climate system and the role of sustainable agriculture. So I'm going to be handing it over in a moment to our dean, Dr. Stan Blade, but before I do, and before I introduce our guest, I just want to say a few words about Fred Bentley. So again, this Bentley Lecture in Sustainable Agriculture was created to honor Fred Bentley. I never met Professor Bentley, but I certainly feel as though I know him from hearing so much about him within my department, within my faculty, and reading about his work. So Fred Bentley, he did his Bachelor of Science degree in Agriculture back in 1939, his Master's in Soil Science, 1942. So he's a dirt scientist. So I feel that connection to him because I studied soil science as well. And he did those degrees at the University of Alberta. Did his PhD in soil science at the University of Minnesota, became an assistant professor at the University of Alberta in 1946. And he went on to become dean of the faculty of agriculture. And he was an expert on soil fertility and plant nutrition. And he did a lot of his research on so-called gray luvasolic soils at the Breton Plots. If you're familiar with the Breton Plots, it's an agricultural research area that has been up and running since 1929. It's really a kind of gem for agricultural and environmental research that we have in our faculty. And Professor Bentley was an expert on sulfur cycling. And it's fascinating because if you look at his research, I could cite his paper from 1955, Fertilizer Studies with Radioactive Sulfur. This is really quite amazing. In 1955, he was working with sulfur isotopes. So in terms of the sort of biogeochemistry of light-stable isotopes, this is among the pioneering work that was ever done, which is really remarkable. Again, right here in our department, in our faculty. So if you look at the International Atomic Energy Agency training manual, for the use of sulfur isotopes in plant nutrition, they still cite his work. So that's just a reminder to those of you who are students, if you do good quality scientific work with high quality analytical data, it'll literally stand the test of time. So people are still citing his work today. He did international development work in Sri Lanka, Thailand, India, China, Pakistan, and the Sudan. He was a first special advisor in agriculture with the Canadian International Development Agency, CIDA, and he served as the president of the International Society of Soil Science, Canadian Society of Soil Science, Agricultural Institute of Canada, and the Alberta Institute of Agrologists. So really an awesome guy. His contributions to the International Crops Research Institute for Semi-Arid Tropics was honored back in 2001 when they named the conference center after Dr. Fred Bentley. He received an honorary Doctor of Science from the University of Alberta in 1990, and in 2008, the university's most prestigious honor, the University of Alberta Distinguished Alumni Award. He was a fellow of 6 scientific societies, including the Royal Society of Canada. He was honored with the Alberta Order of Excellence in 1987, and then became an officer of the Order of Canada in 1994. And I just want to read one quote from one of his papers, and it's a paper from 1984, so over 30 years ago, on sustainability of farmed lands. And what he said was, agriculture, over the long term, has to be seen as part of a total environmental strategy that aims to sustain food production in integration with care of diverse landscapes, organisms, air, and water. So that's really a pioneering vision. So agriculture is much more than simply putting food on the table, but it's really about stewardship of the environment. So I think it's really a great honor for us to have an opportunity to remember Professor Bentley. So with that, I would like to introduce our dean, Dr. Stan Blade, to say a few words. Stan?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have all of you here this afternoon. I have a very simple, a very pleasant task, just to welcome you to the Bentley Lecture, and maybe just to remind you that, as Dr. Shattuck has refreshed our memories, that this is the 14th lecture in this series. The Bentley Lecture has always addressed topics of the day, things that are important to our farming community, to the agri-food sector, to the research component of the work that's done in this area. And if I think back just in the last 3 or 4 months of experiences that I've had, whether it's participating in the Premier's panel that was led by Andrew Leach in starting to formulate ideas here within the province of Alberta about climate change writ large, and the presentations that we did both for the agriculture and for the forestry sectors. If I think about Paris and the representation that our faculty had through Deborah Davidson and others to talk about climate smart agriculture and in the importance of that in the broader thinking around Paris and COP21, to the announcement just in the last month or so of an actual climate change office here in the province of Alberta, where there is great expectations of a whole array of opportunities and issues that will have to be addressed by all of the citizens of Alberta, but particularly in some of the areas that we think of very closely in our work, in our studies, in our research, in our activities with our broader community. So it's great to have you here. I'm very much looking forward, and I certainly appreciate the fact that Dr. Sauchyn has accepted our invitation to provide this Bentley Lecture. I'm very much looking forward to it. I'll hand things back to Bill so that we can get things going. And my thanks, of course, to Dr. Shattuck as well for pulling this all together alongside a team of many others to make this afternoon a success. So sit back, enjoy. I'm very much looking forward to the lecture. And back to Dr. Shattuck. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, thanks, Dan. So I just would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. David Sauchyn, and as I said, it's really a great pleasure to welcome David here. So he's a senior research scientist at the Prairie Adaptation Research Collaborative, and he's professor of geography at University of Regina, and he's been on the faculty there since 1983. He did his bachelor's degree in geography at the University of Alberta, so he's been on this campus before. His master's in geography, University of Colorado, PhD, again geography at the University of Waterloo in Ontario. And Dr. Sauchyn's main interest is the climate of the past millennium in the Western Interior. So this is really cool. So he's going to provide us with a perspective of the past 1,000 years, and it's a time frame people aren't often familiar with. And one of his main research interests then is what this past climate can tell us about the climate that we can expect in the future. He's involved with 2 national centers of excellence, the Sustainable Forest Management Network and the Canadian Water Network. He's co-investigator in a 5-year multidisciplinary comparative study of institutional adaptation to climate change in northern Chile and the Canadian Plains. He's also involved in an international training program in rural water conservation in Chile. His other international scientific activities include Canadian leader of the International Geological Correlation Project, and that's on drylands change, past, present, future. And his international work has brought him not only to Chile, but also South Africa, Ukraine, and throughout the United States. Among his many affiliations, Dr. Sauchyn is past president of the Canadian Quaternary Association and the Canadian Geomorphological Research Group, national director of the Canadian Water Resources Association, a member of the National Advisory Committee for climate change impact scenarios, and a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographic Society. In 2001, he received the John Warkentin Award for scholarly contributions of the geography of the Western Interior, and he's been the Wiley Royal Canadian Geographical Society Distinguished Guest Lecturer, Kansas Academy of Science Distinguished Guest Speaker, and Owen Holmes Lecturer at the University of Lethbridge. So David, it's a great pleasure. Welcome.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you, Dr. Shoddick, for that lengthy introduction. And I want to tell everybody how pleased I am that Bill contacted me with an invitation to give the Bentley Lecture, especially as an alumnus of this university and a chance to visit my hometown. And actually, Dr. Bentley's career and my undergraduate studies overlapped by a few years, and I only wish I had taken a course from him. So if we can load the presentation then. Okay, got it. Good. And if you can't see the details in these slides, please let me know. We can dim the lights. But I think it's adequate. This is a rather romantic image of agriculture in Alberta. You notice that the crop has been seeded and harvested to avoid the slough in the background, and there's wildlife in the scene, of course, the rainbow, and quite a robust local community, judging by the condition of the farmstead and the church. This is a mural that is, or at least was, painted on a building in Hanna, Alberta, and this is the area in which my grandparents homesteaded. There's my grandfather Stuking, and there's a photograph of my grandfather with a team of oxen disking the prairie sod, and next to him his brother on a plow and a team of oxen plowing the prairie sod. This was in May 1914 when they were homesteading at Richdale, Alberta, which is virtually a ghost town now because this region is one of the special areas. It was depopulated in the 1930s. And so my grandparents took my mother and her siblings and they moved because this practice of tilling the sod, they discovered, was not sustainable. The soil blew away in the 1930s, and so they ended up near Edmonton, east of Edmonton, and with a lot of hard work, my grandparents created this farm between Lougheed and Hardisty, Alberta, about 2 hours east of Edmonton. And this is my image of sustainable agriculture. It's a very diverse operation. Let's try over here. The barn with beef cattle and milk cattle, and the separator was in this building. There is a chicken coop, hog barns, draft horses, and a huge vegetable garden. And so this was the heyday of the mixed farm. What's noticeable is there's no machinery in the scene. My grandfather was still using a team of draft horses. This picture was taken in the 1950s, and an indication of that is the vintage of the mail truck. The mailman happened to be dropping off the mail when this picture was taken from the air. Now, as a young man growing up in suburban Edmonton, this was a fantastic place to spend the summer. But things were very different back then. In fact, if you visit the family farm today, you wouldn't recognize it. It's nothing like this. And back then in the 1950s, people weren't talking about climate change. In fact, back then, we assumed that the climate did not change. Even scientists had no notion that climate could change within our lifetime. We recognized, or at least scientists at the time recognized, that over geologic time, there were ice ages and there were major climate changes. But to even conceive that the climate can change within a human lifespan wasn't on the radar. Well, let's fast forward by about half a century. And in 1998, the federal government proposed a Canadian Climate Impact and Adaptation Research Network. And they said, well, let's construct a physical node, an office, in a region of Canada where the effects of climate change are significant and where there is already some research adaptation capacity and coordination. So they chose the prairies because they recognize that the agricultural community has a history of adaptation to climate change. Agriculture is the sector that has undergone the most adaptation when you consider that farming practices were imported from Western Europe and have succeeded on the Canadian plains, but only through a great deal of adaptation. And the other reason they gave for establishing an office in Regina was the presence of the national headquarters of the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration. PFRA no longer exists, but at the time it was given as the reason for putting park at the University of Regina. And so on March 24th, 2000, our local MP, Ralph Goodale, who at the time was the Minister of Natural Resources, established park. And park's mandate included supporting this kind of research on the prairies because there wasn't a lot of climate change research being done, at least on impacts and adaptation in the 1990s. And so we were given a pot of seed money to spread around the prairie provinces. We established a scholarship program, and we supported a large number of graduate students, including a bunch at the U of A. And we undertook collaboration between park and researchers across the prairies. And so there is a history of collaboration between scientists at park and researchers at the U of A. This list is chronological, so 8 to 12 years ago, we were working with Deborah Davidson and some other scientists on a series of research projects. Recently, I made a rather small contribution to David Kahane's ABCD project that recently ended. And the last project is ongoing. This is a current collaboration that I have with researchers at the U of A. Something else we've done at Park is we've been asked to give talks on climate change. And so personally, I've given more than 300 public talks on climate change across the prairies. And I'm just going to scroll through a list of recent talks I've given since 2010. And I've highlighted certain key words, and I want you to just scan this list and get a sense of the audiences that I prefer to talk to. They are mostly farmers and ranchers. Whether they are gathering as a local watershed group, as a crop production association, as a grazing association, as part of the rural municipality. Whenever there's a request put forward to Park to speak to local rural people in Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, I always leap at the opportunity. And yet, my colleagues at the university say, how can you enjoy speaking to people who don't believe in climate change? Because after all, there are a lot of skeptics. There are a lot of people in the rural prairies who either don't believe in climate change or haven't seen it. Well, I find this quite rewarding. It's challenging in a way, but I kind of rewarding. And the approach I take is I imagine that I'm speaking directly to my aunts and uncles and cousins who farm in central Alberta. And at family reunions, they tease me about being a scientist and an academic because they're all farmers. But it's all in good faith. And they ask me to explain climate change. And so I do this quite often to rural audiences. And occasionally, my aunts and uncles and cousins are there in the audience. So I don't have to imagine them, because here's a talk I gave at the fair in the hockey rink in Sedgwick, Alberta. And no sooner had I taken this picture than my Aunt Pearl and my cousin Brian showed up from Hardisty to listen to my talk. Another way that I like to reach the rural community about climate change is to contribute to the magazines that they read. So I do a lot of interviews with Western Producer, and I've begun to write a regular article on climate change for this magazine. And they had a climate issue last fall, and I wrote an article that I called "The Earth is Round, but Is the Climate Warming?" I played devil's advocate. I said, look, if you live on the prairies, the world is flat. Look outside, it's flat. And don't believe those scientists who say it's round. And so therefore, why should we believe scientists who say that the climate is changing? And then I went on to explain why you should believe those scientists. Just like we believe geophysicists who tell us, and we believe astronauts who tell us the Earth is round, even though we can't see it from a farm somewhere in central Saskatchewan. We should also believe scientists when they tell us that the climate is changing quite dramatically and the causes. I get an interesting reaction to this article. I got quite a bit of reaction, either directly or from the editor, right across the spectrum. Of course, I had a group of farmers who told me that I should apologize for saying things like this. And they told me what I needed to read. I had other farmers who said it was the best thing they ever read on climate change and everything in between. And there's an article, I wrote an article on the Paris talks, and it's being published in the winter edition of this magazine. And I think for the summer edition, I'm going to write up this talk with Bill's permission, write up the text of this talk, and submit it to the editor of this magazine. If you're not familiar with this magazine, it's read by 130,000 farmers on the prairies. This is as opposed to writing a peer-reviewed technical paper that gets read by maybe a dozen of your colleagues. This stuff is read by 130,000 farmers. In a magazine published on the prairies that advocates sustainable agriculture, thus farming for tomorrow. So this organization that publishes this magazine is dedicated to sustainable agriculture. So is this group. Here's another Canadian-based organization that advocates sustainable agriculture, that advocates that we create a healthy rural landscape, and that gives Canadians the opportunity to play a role in this process by supporting farmers and ranchers to enhance and maintain ecosystem services. And here are their key principles. I'll let you read this bulleted list. Most of it is pretty straightforward. Community-based, farmer-delivered, science-based. Not so obvious in a couple principles, so I've added a few notes by what they mean by, for example, integrated is reference to the fact that their programs should complement existing conservation programs, government policy initiatives to protect and maintain the rural agricultural landscape. Okay, so you can think of these as principles of sustainable agriculture. Now I want you to compare this list to this one. Slightly different terminology, but the same concepts. In fact, what I've done is in italics, I've transferred some of the key principles from the previous page to this one, just to draw the connections, to draw the correlation, for example, between transparency and monitoring and accountability, and to use evidence-based versus science-based for the same approach. Okay, so here we have two sets of principles that are essentially identical. This set is the key principles of adaptation to climate change. That correlation is especially relevant and especially applicable if you subscribe to this type of adaptation, which is ecosystem-based. Ecosystem-based adaptation, or EBA, is based on the premise that communities will be resilient if they derive their ecological goods and services from a sustainable, resilient ecosystem. And that ecosystem is maintained if the community practices sustainable adaptive management practices. There's a lot of literature on this approach to adaptation. There's a lot of people in my field who are very committed to this approach whereby you can maintain a healthy rural community and perhaps even a healthy urban community if you protect the ecosystem that sustains your livelihood. Here's a definition derived from the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And here's one paper on the topic where these authors did a review, a literature review, of the peer-reviewed or black literature, the gray literature, and the white literature, which is not easily accessible. But they took all the literature that they reviewed and they classified it by sector. And you noted the dominant sector by far is agriculture. And if you include water and say agroforestry, then nearly all of the examples of ecosystem-based adaptation are in the agriculture sector. And here's another illustration from the same paper, a table where they give examples. These are examples from publications of interventions or activities to achieve ecosystem-based adaptation and to mitigate certain climate change impacts and certain hazards. You notice much of this list is agricultural practices, especially towards the bottom. And much of this list, including soil conservation, rangeland management, wetlands restoration, these are aspects of sustainable agriculture. So maybe I'm making my point obvious, I hope, that it's difficult to make a distinction between sustainable agriculture and ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change. They're nearly one and the same thing. Now, I'm not the first person to draw this connection. I need some water. There's literature like this, and I've just highlighted a couple papers. Ellen Wall and Barry Schmidt from Waterloo. And they pointed out that sustainable agriculture and the capacity to adapt to climate change depends on the viability of a farm's natural resources. And I'll let you read the other points they make. And from international perspective, the authors Muley and Nigley, they suggested that sustainable agriculture is very well suited to adaptation to climate change for these reasons, including the fact that sustainable practices tend to make use of local resources and therefore are well adjusted to local climate variability. And you can read the other three bullets. What I want to do is I want to shift the focus from national and international to local, to Alberta. I want to talk about adaptation to climate change in Alberta. Here's an image of southern Alberta. In the Tabor area, the village of Enchant is somewhere in this image. What you see is adaptation to climate change. This entire landscape is an expression of the adaptation to agriculture to a dry climate. What do you see? Center pivoted irrigation, strip cropping. There's some land that's too dry, too sandy, too stony, and it's left in pasture. You can see canals, reservoirs. This is an agricultural landscape that has evolved to sustain agriculture through drought. And there's hardly any better example in the world of a landscape that has this degree of adaptation and this degree of adaptive capacity amongst the local producers and the local communities. And that adaptation has not only sustained agriculture in the region, but it has produced an increase in yield. This is crop yield data, wheat yield data from southern Alberta, courtesy of my colleague Stefan Kienzl at the U of L. In blue is annual wheat yield from irrigated land. In brown is the wheat yield on dry land. And green is the annual precipitation. There is an upward trend in wheat yields on both irrigated land and dry land. And this represents a whole set of adaptations to a dry climate and to other forces, economic forces, social forces, and so on. But what's obvious is that the yield on irrigated land is much higher and it's much more consistent, which is the whole purpose of irrigation. Irrigation is, globally, the major adaptation to a dry climate. But note that in some years, there are decreased yields, especially on the dry land, and these correspond to years of low precipitation. That's a no-brainer. You can't grow too much without water, even where you practice irrigation. So despite all of that adaptation, we are still challenged to produce good yields in dry years. Drought is by far the greatest challenge that farmers face in this part of the world. In fact, there was a paper that came out recently looking at drought all over the world. And the drought-induced crop losses were greatest in the developed countries, not in the developing countries, not in the poor countries. And that's because their yields are low to begin with. They face so many other challenges that drought is just one of them. Whereas in Canada, the US, Western Europe, we've pretty much dealt with all the other stresses, all the other hazards. We still haven't been able, and probably never will be able to deal with drought. And so the largest drought-caused crop losses were in the developed countries. And you can see it right here. Although there's an anomaly here. Look at, I think it's 1970. Very wet year, and virtually no wheat yield. And that's probably because the land was underwater. So water's a good thing unless you have too much. Just talk to producers in southern Manitoba, where they've had a bunch of wet years, and 10% of the land in southern Manitoba is underwater of the cropland. So, but there are years in which there's good water, like early 1990s, when the wheat yields were more or less the same, in fact, essentially the same on the irrigated land and the dry land. Now, what's going to happen going forward? If this is the past, if this is the history of precipitation and wheat yields back to the 1950s, under a changing climate, well, we can't possibly predict the future. It's impossible. In fact, scientists don't use that terminology. Scientists don't talk, they don't predict, they don't talk about prediction. They talk about scenarios and projections and that kind of language. So here are some climate projections for the Western prairies, comparing the climate of a future 3 decades to a past 3 decades. So this is the amount of climate change we expect in the middle part of this century as compared to the recent past. Winter on the left, summer on the right, temperature change on the vertical axis, precipitation change on the horizontal axis. 0, 0 indicates there will be no change. Well, each of these triangles is output from a climate model. Because we can't know the future, we can only simulate it. And every one of those models plots between 1 and about 6 degrees of increased temperature, and nearly every model plots to the right of the 0 mark on the horizontal axis. In other words, the consensus, the dominant scenario amongst all of these models is a much warmer winter and a wetter winter. Summer is a bit different. Summer also is warmer, but only ranges from about 1 to 4 degrees, so not as much warming. And also, most of the models plot to the right of 0, but about 1/3 of the models plot below 0. And even those that have positive anomalies, even those models that project increased precipitation, it's not much. It's only on the range of 0 to 13%, as compared to the increased evaporation we can expect as a result of a warming climate. So the conclusion I would draw from this plot is we can expect that summer will be warmer, not much warmer, but warmer, and possibly drier. And this is pretty much all you need to know about the future climate of the prairies, because we can't possibly know. We can only derive scenarios based on output from models, and these models disagree to some extent. They all plot in the same direction, but the degree of change depends on the model that you choose. You notice there's a fairly large spread amongst the models. And in fact, you can take the same model and run it again and again and again, and each time you get a different future climate. That's because the climate system is incredibly complex. The system is complex, therefore the models are complex, and therefore they can take different trajectories and produce from the same model, with slightly different initial conditions, a different future climate. Those of us who use these models have to explain why they don't agree with one another. And so there's been a bunch of recent papers written about the model spread, about the discrepancy between the models, and how users of this information should interpret these models. And here's a couple papers on how do we communicate projections of future climate. Well, the problem is the difference between the future climates is not a function of human activities. It's not a function of what we're doing to the world. It's a function of the complexity of the climate system and the large amount of natural variability. So these authors from the US on the top and from the Europe on the bottom, they both reached the conclusion that it's the natural internal variability of the climate system that limits our ability to project the future. And it's especially problematic over North America. It's especially problematic in winter and at high latitudes. Well, we're in North America, we're at high latitudes, and our water is derived from melting snow. So we live in the part of the world where it's most difficult to get a handle on the direction that the climate is taking, because we have so much natural variability in our climate system. And these authors at the bottom says there's not much we can do about it, it's irreducible. So we not only have to understand the human impact on the climate system, we not only have to understand anthropogenic global warming, we have to have a better understanding of just the natural variability of the climate system. And I subscribe to the advice of Winston Churchill. Apparently he said that the farther back you look, the further forward you can see. Well, if we use the weather records for Alberta, they go back 50, maybe 100 years. So if you take this advice, you can only look 50 to 100 years in the future at most. So what we do in our lab is we go back 1,000 years instead. Here is the amount of water in the South Saskatchewan River in southern Alberta back to the year 1108. And if there was a lot of water, it's blue, there was surplus water. If water was lacking, it's red. You can compare the last 100 years for which we have river gauge data to the preceding 900 years, and you'll see that those of us who've been on the prairies for the past 100 years have experienced a small range of water levels than in the past. If your family is indigenous, then your family has been through a lot more climate variability than those of us who arrived in the last 100 years. And in particular, I want you to note that there are times when the river dropped into the red zone and stayed there for almost a century. Here is a century of drought. Here's another century of drought. There's no reason that can't reoccur. And this really happened. This is not a model. This is not some numerical simulation. We derived this information from trees. So in our lab at the University of Regina, we have more than 8,000 pieces of wood. When we sand it, when we scan it, the wood looks like this. We see the annual increments of tree growth. Trees are plants. They need heat, light, moisture, carbon dioxide. And so we can determine how much of those determinants of plant growth were available every year for the past 900 years. And on the prairies, what limits tree growth more than anything else is water. In summertime, there's plenty of heat, there's good soil, there's lots of light, there's lots of carbon dioxide, and there's lots more now than there ever was. And so what limits tree growth is the availability of water. And that's how we are able to reconstruct how much water has been in the soil at each one of these 200 triangles. Because at each one of these points, we've been collecting wood for the last 25 years. And notice how most of our wood is coming from Alberta, and most of it's coming from the Rocky Mountains. This is where most of our water comes from. Even 60% of the people in Saskatchewan get their water from the Alberta Rockies. And this is where we find the oldest trees. This information, it turns out, is quite useful, especially for the ag sector. One of those triangles in that map is in the Porcupine Hills of southwestern Alberta. There's the Porcupine Hills in the background. They're covered in trees, but surrounding the Porcupine Hills is crop and pasture. The water that drives the tree growth also drives the growth of the pasture and the crops. And so every one of those 300 talks I've given to ranchers and farmers, I use our tree ring data because they like it. They don't like models. Models are hypothetical, they're abstract. This is from a piece of wood. And like I said, we have a lot of interaction with the ag sector, including when we collect the wood, we have to get permission. Because in the foothills of Alberta, it's either owned by ranchers or leased by ranchers. And so it's common courtesy to ask them if we can take a chainsaw to their trees. And they always say yes. They say things like, you know what, our cattle don't eat trees, they eat grass, so get rid of the trees, please. And they love to talk about the weather. So here I'm chatting for hours with Reno and his ranch on Tennessee Creek in the Porcupine Hills. And he said, you know, Dave, he said, you can go up in the forest and collect some wood, but you won't find any old trees because I had a sawmill. He said, I used to take, when I was younger, I'd go up in the Porcupine Hills and I'd cut down big Douglas fir and I'd drag him down here and I'd run it through a sawmill. And I noticed something. He said, I looked at the trees and I saw a 60-year weather cycle. He said, it could be 70, it could be less, because with the weather, nothing is written in stone. Perfect. These people understand the weather and the climate. We've spent years and years and probably hundreds of thousands of dollars in research funding to reach the same conclusion. We take the trees, we take them to our lab, we polish it, we scan it, we run it through some sophisticated software, image analysis, we run it through statistical packages, and we come up with a 60-year cycle. This is a wavelet transformation of our tree ring data. Across the bottom is a time scale back to 1200. This is for the Old Man River. Along the vertical axis is the length of the cycle. And if it's a powerful cycle, it's in red. And you can see that there is power in the range of 4 to 8 years. This is La Nina and El Nino, which has a strong effect on our weather. Look outside. El Nino has produced a warm, dry winter, just like it usually does. And therefore, it's been affecting tree growth for at least 900 years. But there we have a 60-year cycle. Now, it's one thing for Reno to see it. Scientists don't just observe things, they have to explain it. We get paid to explain things. And so we've spent a lot of time relating these cycles to what drives rainfall in Western Alberta, which is evaporation from the Pacific Ocean and the migration of this moist air over the Rocky Mountains and onto the plains. And so really, what explains the weather and climate and water of Alberta is the circulation of the Pacific Ocean and the rate at which the Pacific Ocean circulates. It circulates really at two scales: a high frequency, which is El Nino, La Nina, and a lower frequency or a slower circulation, which is decadal. And we call that the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. Why should people in the ag sector know about this? Because we can actually explain when and why we get flooding and drought based on this scientific information. Otherwise, you get politicians and people in government saying, we couldn't possibly have anticipated this drought. Or we hear, we couldn't have possibly anticipated that Manitoba would be underwater in 2010. Yes, you could. The science is there to anticipate these things. And so really, sustainable agriculture and adaptation to climate change could take these cycles into consideration. But that's my biased perspective, of course, because I spent 25 years studying it. For example, there was a period of dry years, the late 1970s, the 1980s, the early 2000s. There was a lot of dry years. And as a result of about 30 years of dry weather, the lakes on the prairies began to shrink. I gave a talk in Sherwood Park on a beautiful fall day in 2008. After my talk, I ran out to Cooking Lake because my dad and I used to hunt there, and I looked for our duck blind. I couldn't find it because I couldn't find Cooking Lake. It had been shrinking for 30 years. It's come back since then. And you notice these cottages on the shore? These cottages were built in the 1970s and maybe early 80s when the lake was at their doorstep. Then there was a shift in the climate regime, and Cooking Lake began to retreat. They moved their pier, and then they eventually gave up. They blamed government. They blamed farmers, which is nonsense. It was the PDO. It was the 60-year cycle in the climate of the prairies. Shortly after that, it shifted again. What's happened? Parts of the prairies are underwater. This is near Rosetown, Saskatchewan. The Rosetown water truck is stuck because the grid road is underwater. And the further east you go on the prairies, the worse the situation is. So we've shifted into a wet cycle. And despite the drought this past spring, and despite the dry winter, we are in a period of mostly wet years. The probability of a really bad drought, a long drought, is fairly small right now. But it's going to shift, and when it does, chances are pretty good. Sometime in the next 20, 30 years, there will be a severe drought on the prairies, and it's going to reoccur. It's going to occur during a period of global warming. There's my prediction. Of course, I won't be around to verify it, but based on what we know about the past and 900 years of tree ring data, we can expect these natural cycles to keep occurring, but in an increasingly warming climate. For example, this is something we've done that people in the ag sector find useful. We've used the 1930s as the worst case that we, being non-Aboriginal, have experienced. But there was a drought from 1717 to 1724 that it was of similar length, but much greater severity. So if you compare those water deficits, there were years like 1718 where there's a 46% water deficit or a 41% water deficit. So that decade of the 17 teens was like the 1930s, but much, much worse. And who has found this useful? Well, Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada has supported us to do this work because they had, until the previous government canceled this program, they had a program to prepare for the next bad drought. And they used our reconstruction of paleo or past droughts, took that information to the ag sector, to industry, and to farmers, and got them to think about what are we going to do if we get a drought that's much worse than the 1930s. And they didn't have to use some hypothetical example. They could use the 17 teens when we know for a fact there was a really bad drought. And we've taken this information directly to farmers. So here's a group of crop producers. Anybody want to guess where this is? While I have a drink. Shout it out. Camrose, good guess. Could be. I'll give you a hint. They're wearing blue jeans, they got baseball caps, and they drive pickup trucks. Does that help? Actually, this is in the Central Valley in Chile. If you hang out with these guys, it's the same conversation. It's in Espanol, it's a different language, but what they talk about is the same stuff that people in Two Hills and Camrose talk about it. We take the information to them because we have a major project in Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia. And my co-investigator on this project is Dr. Fernando Santibanez, University of Chile. It's funded by the Canadian government. It's a 5-year project, and it ends next month. So I'm spending the rest of the winter in Chile and Argentina working with Fernando. There's Fernando. He's an agronomist. He's the director of a large agronomy and agricultural research center, University of Chile. He does a lot of work for the wine industry. And here he is presenting, giving a talk just like I am, in this case to a small farming community in Chile. This is what we've done on this 5-year project. There's about 50 researchers, a whole bunch of graduate students, a few postdocs. It's a big project. On the left is our scientific analysis. Numbers, numerical modeling. On the right, we take the information to the local community. The communities of Rush Lake and Shaunavon in Saskatchewan, and Tabor and Pincher Creek in Alberta. We do this because we are studying these people, and we have an obligation to share the results. But also, the way that we interpret the science depends entirely on what they tell us. Otherwise, science is nothing more than data and information. Without the social context, we won't achieve knowledge and especially wisdom. So this scientific project has been driven very much by what the farmers and ranchers have told us, what's important, what's relevant, what do you need to know. The scientists are taking our cues from the local farmers and ranchers, so we spend a lot of time with them. Here's a little meeting in Swift Current. The people around the table are producers. The 4 people in the background are PhD students. These PhD students spent a summer living in these 4 communities, a month in each community, and they conducted 170 interviews. Each interview was at least an hour, but typically half a day or a day, because the people fed them. I mean, they went to each farm and ranch and sat in the kitchen and talked to these people and collected a lot of information about their perception and experience with weather and climate, how it affected them, and what they found was effective in dealing with extreme weather and climate. And we assembled this huge database, and here's just a snippet of information from this database. We made a distinction between just the producers themselves and people in the community had some kind of governance role, decision-making role beyond just the farm. And here is our most recent meeting. Last September, we spent a week in the Cypress Hills in Alberta and Saskatchewan. We had our colleagues from Latin America come up, and we invited as many ranchers and farmers and local decision makers as the resort can accommodate. We spent a full day sitting around tables talking about the results of our research project. And then we spent another day outside, another beautiful fall day, going to several ranches and farms and talk to people who are practicing sustainable agriculture. So here's one of those ranches. And the rancher, you can spot the ranchers and the academics. There's a clear distinction. It's the cowboy hats, I guess. But that rancher, you can see his son next to him, said something that resonated with me. He said, you know, raising cattle in this part of the world requires water, grass, and shelter. I can replace only one of these. If the trees die, he can build shelter. He can build corrals and structures to protect the cattle. If he abuses the water and grass, that's it. He can't make water and grass. Nature does. And so he took us around the ranch and showed us how he's fenced it off so he can move the cattle often, but he's also fenced off all the sloughs and dugouts and wetlands and used solar power to pump the water to the cattle. So this was just one local rancher of many that we visited who are well positioned to deal with climate change. Because if you have a sustainable agricultural operation, then you're likely will withstand the climate changes that we have projected. Well, after talking to ranchers and farmers for 5 years and including this meeting in the Cypress Hills, we've come up with a set of recommendations for government based on what they told us. Now, it's a very large document. I'm only going to show you a few bullets. They talked about how we have to be proactive and not reactive. They talked about how, as a community, we need to be planned and be prepared, even if the risk seems remote and when times are good. This applies perfectly to drought. We should be preparing for drought when we have too much water or enough water, because the next drought is on the way, we know for sure. They acknowledge that institutional capacity is important because there's only so much that a local farmer or rancher can do on their farm or ranch. There has to be coordination, there has to be policy. Watershed groups fulfill a role. They are very well positioned to test and implement adaptations at a local scale. They're very well positioned to develop drought preparedness plans, but they need to be supported and their capacity needs to be supported because quite often these local watershed groups are staffed by volunteers. And quite often they lack the technical knowledge. And the farmers and ranchers told us that they think that in recent years there has been developing a gap in technical knowledge because there used to be a lot more extension programs. Universities, government have been phasing out extension programs, especially government. And so these farmers and ranchers say, well, you know, all this science is nice, but what do we do with it if we don't have local capacity? The university scientists aren't going to stick around and help them implement these recommendations. So they told us there has to be some kind of collaborative network of local people, watershed groups, researchers, and all levels of government. We have to work on this together to enable the local people to adapt to climate change. And finally, they said what we really need is a single coordinating agency with this mandate. We need a government agency that can link science, to the concerns of local rural people, that delivers technical expertise on climate, water, and adaptation in a rural setting. So we heard this again and again, and we all sat around and thought about it and said, wait a minute, we used to have something like that. It was called PFRA. What these farmers and ranchers have told us is we have to resurrect PFRA. Because with the demise of Ag Canada, with the demise of extension programs, and especially with the demise of PFRA, it was phased out between 2010 and 2013. We no longer have government agencies with the capacity to help local people adapt to climate change. And I wouldn't be surprised if this government, if not in their first term, but in a subsequent term, bring back something like PFRA. It'll never be the same. We've lost that capacity. We've lost a huge amount of technical capacity and good people, and they've shredded a lot of information and so on. But yeah, that was a really interesting recommendation that these people, they really lament the loss of something like PFRA. Okay? Now I just have 2 slides left because I've been talking long enough. I want to tie this together from a high level, so to speak. I want to make the connection once more between adaptation to climate change and sustainable agriculture in a very broad context. In fact, it doesn't get any higher level than the International Space Station. This is a picture of space, of the Earth, where because of the angle and the position of the sun, you can see the atmosphere. The atmosphere in which we live is remarkably thin. 1/2 of the mass of the atmosphere is within 5,000 meters of the Earth. Well, there's lots of mountains that rise higher than 5,000 meters. So you can hike halfway up through the atmosphere if you have the physical ability. And yet, this air, of course, sustains life on our planet. Where do we discharge our waste? Into the air. We have radically changed the chemistry of the atmosphere, and therefore we have changed the Earth's energy balance. The solution is, of course, we have to reduce our impact on the atmosphere, but it's to the point where climate change has occurred. It is inevitable, and therefore some amount, probably a large amount of adaptation is required. So adaptation is a response or a solution to our intervention in the world's climate system. Similarly, sustainable agriculture is a solution to the impact that we've had on soil, on the soil landscapes. You think the atmosphere is thin. The soil is what? 1 meter thick? And soil is by far our most precious resource. Oil is not our most valuable resource. It is soil and water. And because of maladapted or inappropriate agricultural practices, until fairly recently, we've lost a fair bit of soil quality and tilth and structure. And I've already today had some interesting conversations with faculty here about how one of the better adaptations to climate change is to restore the quality of our soil. And from my perspective, my interest is how can we get the soil to retain more water? Because if we're looking at a warmer climate, we are going to want to keep more water on the farm. Well, you can build dams and dugouts, or you can restore the quality and the tilth and the structure and the organic matter of the soil by practicing sustainable agriculture and thereby retain more water. And finally, last slide. Picture I took at sunrise last fall during our meeting with the farmers. It was me and the farmers who were up at sunrise, waiting for the rest of the scientists to wake up. So I walked out to the edge of the cypress hills and took some pictures. And what you see here is at least 4 different ecosystems over a very short distance. I'm standing on the fescue grassland. In the foreground is the aspen forest. Beyond that is the coniferous spruce forest. And beyond that is the mixed grassland, which is pretty much gone. It's now cropland and pasture. So 4 different ecosystems over a short distance, because each of them has a different set of climate requirements. Well, if the climate changes, if the climate varies over such a short distance, as we modify the climate system, you can expect these ecosystems to move. The greatest impact of climate change in our part of the world is going to be the distribution of ecological goods and services. These ecosystems are very sensitive to a small change in climate. And the distribution of water also is very sensitive to a small change in temperature between -1 and +1. A difference of 2 degrees is the difference between ice and water. It's the difference between snow and rain. It's just a difference of 2 degrees. To prevent unfortunate or adverse consequences of climate change, we have to manage these landscapes to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Well, we have lots of opportunity here because we do manage these landscapes. In the foreground is a provincial park. There are people who manage that park. And beyond the provincial park is agricultural land that is owned and managed. So unlike the people in the Arctic, the Inuit, who can't control their environment, we control this environment. And so we have the opportunity to practice a set of agricultural practices that are sustainable and that prevent unfortunate consequences of climate change. One more message, and that is, thanks.
David, that was awesome. That was awesome and absolutely clear and beautiful. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Bill.
So we have an opportunity for questions, and we have 2 volunteers, thank you very much, to take the microphones. So if you have a question, we would like to be able to hear your question, hence the use of these microphones. So the floor is open. If you have a question for Dr. Sauchyn, please just put up your hand.
My name is Tian Gan. I do a bit of research on climate change as well. Hi, Dave. I have a question for you.
Tian, how you doing?
About possible impact of combined impact of climate change and climate anomalies such as ENSO. Have you ever looked into that as well? That would the severe weather be even more severe?
I know that you know that I don't have an answer to that. We've talked about this, but these large-scale climate oscillations, La Nina, the Pacific Tidal Oscillation, these are oscillations of sea surface temperature in the Pacific Ocean. So as the Pacific Ocean circulates, there are pools of warm water and pools of cold water, and they move. And over the warm water, the air is moist and it rises, and over the cold water, the air is cold and it sinks. So actually, the circulation of the atmosphere and our weather and climate is driven mostly by the oceans, because 3/4 of the Earth is ocean. The Pacific Ocean is 1/3 of the Earth's surface. It's 16 times larger than Canada. Okay? So that's just a very brief description of what these are. Differences in sea surface temperature. The problem is we are heating up the oceans. It's been estimated that about 90% of all the extra heat that we are trapping next to the Earth, 90% is going into the oceans. Well, if we are heating up the oceans, then we are changing these, what were natural climate oscillations. And in fact, most scientists concede that we now live in what's called the post-natural world. Nothing is natural anymore. And a lot of scientists have adopted the terminology Anthropocene, the period of human domination, to describe the current geological epoch. So if we are in the process of modifying La Nina, El Nino, and the PDO, we are in the process of modifying the processes that bring water to Alberta. That's a hot, as Tian knows, that's a hot area of scientific research. What are these things going to look like in a warmer climate? Because we can no longer call something natural and something artificial. Everything is artificial in the world of which we've created. Good question.
Fred Bentley had not much patience for the organic movement. Is there any evidence since Fred left us that there's evidence that fertilizer, herbicide, pesticides we put in our soil is affecting the natural fertility of our soil?
You know, there's people in this room that are in a much better position to answer that question than I am. But I have my own personal perspective on the organic movement. I showed you my grandparents' farm. That was an organic farm. They didn't call it that. They didn't use, well, they eventually did use pesticides and herbicides. But I'm not going to weigh into that debate because, like I said, there's people in the faculty here who are doing that kind of research. Yeah. You know, there is this, when you get into adaptation, you get into the realm of values. How we respond to climate change depends largely on your personal values. So, even though we study climate change adaptation, we never tell people what to do, especially farmers and ranchers. Because it depends on the kind of world you want. And in our work, as we work with rural communities, I find some extreme positions in the ag sector. In fact, I tell my friends in the city that I think there's much greater diversity in the rural population than the urban population. When I give talks in some curling rink in small town Alberta, I get people there who practice industrial scale agriculture. They're typically on their BlackBerry or iPhone most of the time, and they're negotiating deals as I'm speaking. And then you get the back to the landers and the organic people and everything in between. So certainly there are technological solutions to climate change. There's some extreme, crazy ideas, geoengineering, about how, we are capable of anything. We can actually completely control the climate, that we have the technology to do that. But do we want to do it? That's a different question. That's where you talk to theologians and philosophers, and those kinds of people. Do we want a world? I'm not going to weigh in on this debate. Do we want a world in which everything is of our own making? including the genetics of organisms. I don't know. I mean, it's one possible way of dealing with climate change.
Thank you. That was very good. I know you've done a lot of work in hydrology and the related part of it. I just wonder, like, carbon and carbon emissions are the real bad guy nowadays. And I don't disagree with what the scientists are saying, but I'm just kind of curious what proportion of the problem may be attributable to us changing the hydrological cycle, draining wetlands, deforesting jungles, replacing grasslands with annual crops, all that impact.
Yeah, that's a good question. And you will get scientists who will assign a percentage to certain human impacts and to natural variability. I'm not sure how they can do that. Well, I know technically how they do it. They'll run a model, and then they'll remove people from the model and run it again. But that assumes the model is perfect. So I don't think you can really, in my opinion, you can't really say to what extent are various human activities and simply the natural variability of the climate system the cause of the observations and the changes that we see. But we can say that each of those is contributing. And it'll only be in retrospect, I think, that we can look back and say, well, this was the dominant cause or that was the dominant cause. And the best tools we have, and models are extremely useful. If you're a scientist, you know that that's saying that all models are wrong, but some are useful. They're all wrong because we can't possibly understand. We can't possibly predict the future. So I don't have an answer to your question. I think, if you want to look at the local scale, if you want to have a watershed in which you have a lot of data, of course, if you have a lot of data, you hardly need to model. But anyway, if you have a watershed where you have a lot of data and a good model, then perhaps you can do that kind of analysis.
I can call her out before she gets here. I'm wondering, and thank you for the lecture, what's your opinion of the Site C Dam as an example of continental scale human-induced climate change adaptation? Do you support it?
Which dam, sorry?
The Site C, except in the country, it's huge.
Oh, is that the name of it? I've heard about it, yeah. People ask, what's the future climate going to be on the prairies? And so I say, I don't know, and nobody knows, but here are the projections, and I present the model projections, and the most consistent projection is a wetter winter. And bingo, no problem, let's just store that water. There's the solution. If we have a wetter winter, and if we have rain in winter, let's just build more dams. That's kind of a knee-jerk reaction. First of all, there's other ways of retaining water. Like I said, if we restore ecosystems so they can store water in the soil and the plants, and that's perhaps a more effective approach and less costly. And also, when you get into mega projects and engineering structures, there's a whole other set of considerations, social and economic. I don't know what about the engineering feasibility. I thought that a lot of the best sites for storing water in Alberta have been utilized. There is a proposal also for a dam on the South Saskatchewan River near Medicine Hat, the Meridian Dam. There's also, somebody had a proposal for sucking the water back from Saskatchewan. Because there's a huge dam just over the border called the Gardner Dam. and Lake Diefenbaker. So if necessary, you could, if there's more water than Saskatchewan needs, you could suck it back to Alberta. Hi, Greg.
One quick question. So a lot of what you do with tree rings and your structure that you do, does that really do just the superficial groundwater? With groundwater extraction being an ever-increasing issue in this province and future potential changes we don't really know yet with reductions in glacier size and glacier melt, because we don't know if that's a major groundwater source or not, or where our recharge is. How confident are you in your projections? Because I think the groundwater issue and the groundwater adjustments that are part of the climate change and climate change adaptation are going to be a big component of understanding our system.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, groundwater is a huge opportunity in Alberta.
Its volume is
Massive,
massive.
and we don't really know. And I understand you've got a proposal to study that. Yeah, I mean, I think there already is an investment in groundwater research, and it probably, that's a good investment in research funds. Yeah. It's funny how beyond the prairies, there is this misconception that on the prairies we irrigate using groundwater. I've had people in Ottawa tell me that. I've had people in Ottawa ask me, is your water table dropping? And I say, why? He says, because you irrigate so much in Alberta and Saskatchewan. No, we don't use groundwater. But maybe we should, and we probably will have to. Yeah. And there's another opportunity for storage. There's that, that concept of diverting. If you have excess water, if you have a flood, divert it underground, store it underground.
So you mentioned that we are changing the ocean and atmospheric cycling. And I guess the one thing we wouldn't be able to change is solar cycling. And so I'm curious, with chronologies that long, can you see evidence of solar cycles affecting the prevalence of drought or anything like that? And could that be used in future projections?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And when I threw up that image of that wavelet plot, I highlighted the two cycles, one at 60 years and one at 4 to 8 years. There was another cycle there, around 12 to 15 years, which is most likely the sunspot cycle. So sunspots do have an influence on our climate. Not, as far as we can tell, not to the extent of these sea surface temperature anomalies and oscillations, but it's there. Yeah.
Dave, you seem to be interested in Southern Alberta irrigation. So do you feel that irrigation district is sustainable, especially with the Bow River and the water rights?
Another great question. I tend to think so. And I might be suffering a bit of bias here. You know, there's this phenomenon where if you work with somebody for long enough, you begin to sympathize with them. It happens to reporters in Ottawa. It happens with people that are kidnapped, and they begin to sympathize with their... I've been doing a lot of work with people in the ag sector, and in particular the irrigation districts. And I begin to sympathize with the work they're doing, and they've done a lot in southern Alberta, the irrigation districts. They've done a lot in terms of increasing water use efficiency. They pretty much maxed it out. They pretty much, with center pit irrigation and low pressure irrigation, the drop structures and so on, they're approaching the most efficient irrigation systems in the world, comparable to those in the Middle East. And you know, we had a 2-day meeting with the irrigation districts in Tabor. We just sat down and talked for 2 days, and Man, I learned a lot about irrigation. And they said a couple things that struck me. One was, at one point after I gave a little talk, this irrigation district manager said, Dave, I'll believe in climate change when we get weather that I don't expect. Well, that's a perfect definition of climate change. Because climate is a certain set of weather within certain range. And if you get weather outside that range, it's either just a really weird climate event and you haven't been around long enough to experience it, or if it happens again and again, it's climate change. So I had to acknowledge to these irrigators that we haven't yet seen enough unusual weather to say in Alberta that it's climate change. You can't attribute a single extreme event like the Calgary flood. You can't say that's climate change. It's the weather. But what they did tell us is they think in southern Alberta they are well prepared for drought because they have this incredible irrigation infrastructure. 50 dams and reservoirs, thousands of kilometers of pipelines and canals and so on. This incredible distribution system. What they can't handle is flood. The flooding of 2013 wasn't confined to the city of Calgary or High River. They lost some irrigation infrastructure because that stuff is built not for flooding, but for drought, which is a completely different engineering design. That stuff is built to deliver water, not to shed it. And so they have a real concern in southern Alberta. What happens if we get more intense rainfalls? How are we going to handle that when we got way more water than we need and that it's carrying debris, it's all kinds of dirt and debris that's being carried through the canals and filling up the reservoirs and inundating the cropland. And so they are more concerned with flooding than with drought in southern Alberta, until you get a drought that's 10 years long, or 20 years long, or 50 years long. Then any amount of irrigation isn't going to help. And me too, I think.
Thank you very much. David, it was an excellent presentation. You covered a lot of topics of interest to a lot of people. So thank you very much for doing that. So please join me in thanking our speakers. And before you disappear, there's a couple of people I want to thank, and especially Sharon Kaitsa for all of the work that she did to make this event run as easily as it is run for some of us, and Christy Nohos in our department. But a special thank you to our sponsors. So in order to put on this event, we've had some help, and I want to thank the Alberta Institute of Agrologists, Alberta Innovates, BioSolutions, the Alberta Wheat Commission, Bayer Crop Sciences, and Dow AgroSciences. Very grateful to them for their support. And thank you very much. You've been a great audience. Enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you in about a year for the next Bentley Lecture in Sustainable Agriculture. Thank you very much.